is Hot Science, and I'm Richard Clarke, and we'll have the week's top news medicine. Thank you for joining me. Okay, welcome everybody. And uh, this week, let me give a rundown of our stories. What I thought was top news was a
To give you
story
our card. Okay. It's Jack in Virginia. That's me.
from
Write to me.
Yes.
Write to me in
Japan
Spanish. I'm trying
and
to
South
write to me.
Korea.
Write to me in English. Anyways, it's
There's
my email
somebody's background noise.
CASR.
I think it's Arden. There we are. Anyway, the top news story was from Japan and South Korea, and the quote is, "I'm afraid to have children." And this is a real significant change that is starting to happen in some places around the world. In technology and EVs, Chinese car makers are targeting more European sales with five-star EVs. They've decided that the key to breaking into the European market is getting the highest safety rating that is available. And in the environment, uh, I have a story. A machine recycles plastic bottles into 3D printer filament. And here the design was released as public domain instead of patented. And in materials, we now have a alternative to concrete. It's called hempcrete. And this is a building material that consumes CO2, and now it has finally come to the US. The limitations in the US have been the marijuana laws that for a long time prevented the use of hemp as well. Now that looks like that's a thing of the past. And in space, uh, I have an interesting story, and it is millions may live in space, but near Earth. And it's one of the futures that may be available to us. And in biology, the story is embrace what may be the most important green technology ever. It could save us all. And the human story is younger Chinese are spurning the factory jobs that power the Chinese economy. And in health, quote, "This looks like the real deal. Are we inching closer to a treatment for Alzheimer's?" So that's what we have up today. Let me start with the top story. Uh, the headline again was, "I'm afraid to have children. The fear of an older future in Japan and South Korea." The population in Japan, which is the world's third largest economy, has been in decline for years now, and it's expected to plummet from the current 125 million to an estimated 88 million by 2065, and this is a 30% decline. And a Japanese woman can expect to have now an average of 1.3 children during her lifetime, which is well below the average, the 2.1 needed to sustain the population level. And the governments are encouraging people to have more children, but this government encouragement has had little effect. Last year in 2021, the number of births in Japan was the lowest since records had been started kept there in 1899, and the decline in birth rate is faster than was predicted by the experts. Japanese women are increasingly reluctant to marry and have children. They see this as children as creating financial pressures. And a big deal in Japan is the gender roles that really force women to deal with all the child rearing issues and household issues. The male participation in this in Japan is very low. And when you have a child in Japan, the husband keeps working, but the mother is expected to quit her job and look after the children. And women feel like it's just hard to raise children, especially without the help of a partner. The low fertility rate in Japan is partially a symptom of the advances that Japanese women have made, advances of a better education and a rise of the number of women in the workplace, marrying and having children significantly later now, though, than their mothers and grandmothers. With higher education, more young women have similar wages to men, and the average age of first marriage in Japan for women is now 29 years, way beyond the 25 years in the 1980s. But the 1980s were a time when most women only had high school education. And women continue to have the lion's share of household chores, even if they work outside the home. One example of that is less than 14% of new fathers in Japan took paternity leave last year. The traditional ideas about the division of labor in Japan are still very strong, as you can see from this. A similar story is unfolding in South Korea, which has the world's lowest fertility rate and a rapidly aging population. Concerns are growing about the strain on the economy and on the pension system, which they are afraid may become depleted in the coming decades. In South Korea, the country's fertility rate last year was 0.81, and that's the lowest in the world. This is due, at least in part, to the high cost of raising a child and also real estate prices. Like in Seoul, the average price of an apartment has doubled in recent years. And an issue in Korea is in this society, many children start receiving private education as early as age 2 or 3, and their achievements in their life are really determined by their parents' wealth and the cost of their private education. So those who are not financially well off think that giving birth to a child is like committing a sin. An example here is a newlywed office worker woman who has no plans to have children. She says, "My life and my husband's come first. We want a fun life together. And while people say having a child could bring us happiness, it would also mean giving up a lot. And it turns out now in Korea, women are prioritizing personal freedom. And because of this, ruling out marriage. Half of the population in South Korea now believes that marriage is not a necessity. And part of it in Korea is South Korea currently has the worst gender pay gap in the world. And uh, it turns out also the low birth rate may have to do with people's feeling of well being. South Korea has one of the lowest levels of life satisfaction and the highest suicide rate. So maybe to make people want to have more children, they need to figure out how to lead a life that is more satisfying. Japan and South Korea have started reluctantly opening the door to some foreign workers, but there are few signs that either country is willing to embrace mass immigration, which would help this ticking demographic time bomb. And there may be a way to encourage women to have multiple children, but that requires a fundamental change in society, starting with things like gender equality. And those kind of changes are not changes that happen very easily. So I think the future looks pretty grim for both Japan and South Korea. And if you look around the world, there are a lot of other places where they're also forecasting a similar collapse in the population. One of them is Germany. Another one is China. We'll talk about China a little later. So this is one of the things that we face in the future, and it's going to cause trouble for a couple of the major industrial powers.
Well, I can't help but think as a real environmentalist that maybe this is a good thing for the planet. a lot of our problems are basically from too many people. Now, I'm not naive. I know that there's some tremendous problems with a declining population, with pensions and Social Security and on and on. But maybe governments need to just figure out a way to do this, and lower population might be better for the world.
I also think that automation is being offered a real opportunity here, where you can do more with fewer people, and that might bring the prices down too.
Yeah, the article had a lot of detail about that. It was a pretty interesting article about the difficulties of automation, and
yes,
but it still it boils down to the lack of people to keep the economy growing, basically, and the Social Security, Medicare, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And this lack of people, this is a problem that we are going to face in the second half of this century. The population on the planet is going to start declining. That is something that, all the demographic forecasts that I've seen forecast. And, the question is not if it's going to start declining, but when it starts declining. And, the economies of the world are still based on capitalism that wants to find bigger markets for its products all the time. And it's hard to find a bigger market if there are fewer people.
Right.
So,
but a lot can happen between now and 50 or 60 years from now, which is the projection they have.
Yes,
But still, I believe less people is better.
I think you're right. I think Malthusas would agree with you.
But it'll take some severe adjustments, though, because as you said, capitalism is really geared to an ever-expanding population. And so we have to do something there on the economic side.
Well, and one thing is it's the greed of merchants that want to sell ever more that's caused the problem, because we used to have single income families and everybody got along fine until we had to have two income families to support our material demands or needs. And but all that's pushed by advertising and the idea that more material possessions will make you happier.
That's right.
And until you replace that with something else, it's not going to change.
Yeah.
Yes, and
And the
certainly
real,
from Silicon Valley, knew lots of guys with lots of possessions. What I didn't know was lots of guys with lots of possessions with lots of happiness.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And anyway, so let me continue with
Well,
this.
the other thing is the governments don't want, it's not more people they want, it's more taxpayers they want, more workers. And you wonder how that's going to sort itself out once Elon Musk's robots take over much of the work. Will the earnings of those robots be taxed like income, or what's the deal there?
That's just one of the interesting questions about the change in the nature of work and who works.
Like in those Scandinavian countries, the tax rates are all 50%, and all the adults work. There are no single income families.
Hmm. And also in those countries, they typically score high on these happiness surveys.
Not as high as some of those Latin American countries where they have strong religious beliefs and nothing else.
Uh-huh.
But
Okay,
Well,
let me continue with the story. Uh, the next is an EV story, and Chinese EV makers have set their sights on winning over the European market, and particularly the large corporate customers. And they think they'll win them over by having cars that are more affordable and also that have the top safety ratings and lots of high-tech features. In the last few months, several Chinese EV makers have received the European New Car Assessment Program NCAP ratings of 5 stars, which is the highest rating, and this requires vehicles that have active and passive safety features that go well beyond the legal requirements. All Chinese EV makers want to achieve this 5 star rating in order to be more competitive in the European market. And they are trying with these ratings to overcome some negatives about the quality of Chinese made cars. They had crash test failures in 2006 and 2007 in Europe, and these created the impression that Chinese cars were unsafe. And so the Chinese manufacturers have to counter that. And particularly in Europe, the high safety ratings open up the huge corporate car market for these Chinese EVs In Europe, about half of the sale of the cars are fleet sales to corporations and rental agencies. And these corporate buyers put a premium on safety, and a lot of the fleets have a mandatory 5-star rating requirements. Uh, this high demand in Europe for EVs and supply chain shortages have allowed European car makers to raise EV prices and focus more on retail clients, individual clients. These are more profitable than fleet sales, and so the European manufacturers are using this situation to maximize their profits. Of course, this creates a window of opportunity, though, for the Chinese EV makers, and I suspect the Europeans will end up regretting it. In October, for example, a German rental car company, SIXT, said it's going to buy about 100,000 EVs from BYD. This announcement came after a few weeks after this BYD vehicle, the Atto 3 SUV, received its first 5-car rating. Then also China's Great Wall Motors, GMW, has received 5-star rating for 2 of its cars. And European car makers are also pursuing 5-star ratings. I'm surprised they don't have them yet. These include BMW, Volkswagen, and Mercedes. I guess the Europeans have to now compete against the quality of the Chinese manufacturers. And the Chinese manufacturers say there'll be a natural demand for vehicles like ours that are fully equipped and come at very competitive prices. Chinese firms altogether this year are going to sell 150,000 cars in Europe, which is nearly double what they sold in 2021. About half of them are going to be EVs and half conventional cars. By 2030, EVs will make up 40% or more of Europe's new car market, and the Chinese sale of EVs by 2030 is forecast to be at least 10 times higher than it is now. And forget what you might think about the Chinese cars and lower quality. Their quality now is better than others. An example of one of these Chinese cars now is Great Wall Motors Aura brand has a car called the Funky Cat. It's an SUV, and when it goes for sale later this year, it'll sell for about $36,000, which is about $5,000 cheaper than VW's cheap EV. And Funky Cat's features include things like facial recognition to store seating preferences and driver assistance systems and things like this. And they say if a car is well made, laden with feature, and has a high safety rating and is competitively priced, it no longer matters where it is made. And the one place on the planet now where you will find an affordable EV is in China. And so they're trying to leverage that advantage and break into the European market in a big way.
BYD has a substantial electric bus operation, including a large manufacturing facility in California. And of course, electric buses that are used continuously yield a greater environmental
Yes,
improvement than automobiles that are used very little.
right. That's absolutely correct.
BYD has electric bus kits because many countries make buses, and BYD makes the kits to allow the manufacturers to produce electric buses.
Okay. And one
Where are
of the
they going to
things,
get all these batteries?
Uh, Apparently KTEL, but BYD is also manufacturing substantial quantities themselves.
But the materials for the batteries are coming to be in short supply.
but they're still,
nickel or
for the next
whatever,
few
but-
years, they're in short supply, but there are enough supplies that they think will be adequate to handle the tenfold increase in battery production that is coming in the next few years.
And there's a saying that says necessity is the mother of invention, and that's what drives technology in a lot of these areas. So
Right.
I think they'll figure it out.
Yes, and the battery market is getting so big that one of the things that you will see is it start to fragment into different types of battery that, for example, have the highest power density for some applications and the lowest cost for some other applications. And so the battery market is gonna fragment with these new technologies that are coming out.
Richard, that's absolutely right. The battery that's most suitable for a stationary application is different than a battery that is used in a mobile application.
Absolutely. And the batteries you would need on a long range truck are different from a short range car, and the battery you need on a medium range airplane is different from either of those.
Now, I still think that airplanes will be hybrid
Oh,
rather than pure electric.
I think you might be right. And certainly in the aircraft, they are looking strongly at the uh, hydrogen for jet aircraft. I read something today about Rolls-Royce is testing a hydrogen fueled engine. Okay, so next I'm gonna have a story of two uh, brilliant young people who won this year's James Dyson Award. The mission of this award is simple: do something that solves the problem. And these guys won the award because they did something because it solves two problems at once. And so they have invented something they're calling a polyformer, which takes plastic waste and turns it into low-cost filament for 3D printing, which turns out to be a real boon for developing countries. Let me see if I can bring up the video.
Finifying your bottle to be completely smooth and round on the outside. This can be quickly done. Satisfied with your bottle, cut it into a long strip using our custom bottle cutter mechanism. That's it. The polyformer will then output 3D printer filament. Usable, printable.
In addition to recycling plastic bottles, Polyformer produces 3D printer filament at a fraction of normal cost. It is extremely expensive. Its high financial barrier makes 3D printing less accessible to Rwandans by deploying a Polyformer own, locally made filament instead of importing from abroad. This will drastically lower the cost of 3D printing in the country.
So to me, this is exciting. One of the things that starts to be available is they're bringing this capability to places that don't even have a good machine tool industry, and talk about a transformative kind of technology. With the 3D printing, you can make an enormously wide range of things. The only limit is they're not as durable as metal. You can still make mechanical parts and gears and things like that. In fact, this polyformer was designed where many of its parts can be 3D printed. And the inventors, rather than patenting their invention, made it available as an open source thing, and it now is being built in a number of countries around the world. And these inventors, they got a $40,000 award from the Dyson Prize. And what they did with their $40,000 reward is they are deploying several more of these polyformers at companies they work with in Rwanda. So again, rather than feasting off the profits of their invention, what they are using it for is to provide significant upgraded capabilities in places in the world that are very poor and who can make good immediate use of this technology. And if you think about it, what is behind 3D printing is the capability of using computers to model these 3D objects. And that's a fairly advanced use of computers. So it encourages also the gaining of those skills to be able to use this technology. So I think a significant job and an example of an attitude about helping the world that I think is commendable from these two young men.
The 3D printed objects in themselves may not have much strength, but they form a good basis from which to make sand castings.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And sand castings can have a good strength.
Right. And since we've lived with plastic around us most of our life, we know that you can make a lot of things out of plastic that are durable, useful things.
Yeah, it doesn't deteriorate.
They do say that the only real deficiency with this thing is that they don't have a good control on the diameter of the filament. And so the resulting 3D printed things are coarser than they might otherwise be, but still usable and still useful for prototypes and education and all that sort of stuff. It's the makers of the high quality filaments who are kind of mean mouthing the low tech version.
But even if the 3D printed objects are rough, they can be hand finished.
Yeah. And the only other thing about 3D printing is it does take an awful lot of time compared to other manufacturing processes. But when you're not making very many of the items, it's still the right way to go.
And there are other developments of 3D printing using resins and things like that that the lasers go through that are substantially faster. So 3D printing is still a new technology that there is an enormous amount of development going on.
Yeah, the filament printing is different than the laser printing, that's for sure.
Sure. Anyway, and we have another story that is a material story. And uh, as an example now in somewhere in Europe, I'm not sure where, or here it is in Brussels, uh, they've finished rebuilding a 7-room school that was built in the 60s, and it's been completely renovated in a project, and it's become the first Flemish school to ever be built with hemp. And it's one of the companies that's involved in hemp building materials, ISO Hemp, has made the blocks that is used to construct this building, and the blocks are made of hempcrete, which is a mixture of hemp fibers, water, and lime or clay, which acts as a binder. And hempcrete is fire resistant, provides soundproofing, insulates, repels mold and pests, is malleable enough to use for various styles. Plus, hemp is a sustainable crop that needs few pesticides, and hempcrete has a very low carbon footprint. It requires 3 times less heat than concrete, weighs about 1/8 as much as concrete, actively sequesters CO2. Hemp absorbs about twice as much carbon as a forest. So hemp is a real good carbon capture material, and decarbonizing construction can have an enormous effect. This says the construction industry is responsible for 39% of global carbon emissions. I'm not sure how they got that number. Concrete is one of the worst offenders, and about 10% of the world's CO2 is comes from the production of concrete. So this is a particularly uh, big target, and that the kind of unsustainability of concrete is causing a lot of interest in green concrete alternatives. And mainly for a long time in the US, industrial hemp was illegal. And then this changed in 2018 when the Farm Bill distinguished between hemp and cannabis. And then in September of this year, hemp building materials were added to the Model US Residential Building Code, and this paves its way for legal use starting in 2024. The people working on hemp, one of the things they're working on is developing hemp panels similar to plywood. Now, the limitation of these hemp is that it does not have much ability to be a load-bearing material. So you can use it for wall sections and things like that. You can't use it to make something that supports a structure. They're working on it, but they don't have this solved yet. But even without it, again, hemp is one of the fastest growing plants in the world. It grows 50 times faster than wood, and you can create enough biomass from hemp to build a small single family house in about 5 months of growth on 1 hectare of land. And so this is a new possible material. It's hempcrete. You use it to build your wall. It's not very good for smoking.
How does it compare in cost? Can you hear me?
I can just barely hear you.
So how does it compare in cost, I wonder?
They didn't have anything about the cost. Whether it actually succeeds in the marketplace depends very much on the cost. They're looking for sustainable material, but at the same time, they're looking for sustainable material that is less expensive, and
Yeah,
it'll succeed if it's less expensive, I think.
yeah, or at least in the same price range.
A big factor is the installation cost. And bricks have largely been replaced by concrete blocks because the labor cost is a lot
Right.
lower with concrete blocks.
Yes.
And these things would, because they're non-structural, they wouldn't replace a huge amount of concrete, but they might replace 10 or 20% of the concrete currently used. And there's a huge projected demand for concrete blocks as the world moves forward and more housing is required and all this other stuff. So it's probably going to be a important thing.
And again, in general, looking for green substitutes for concrete is one of the areas that I believe we'll see other articles about in the months ahead because there's a lot of research activity going on here.
Yeah, this stuff wouldn't replace concrete for footings because
No,
it's not has no strength, but it would certainly replace concrete wall panels and could be used in commercial construction that is currently steel framed with
just
concrete block fill in the walls.
And as I look across the street from me here in Chapala, they're building a 3-story structure, and it's mainly out of concrete bricks. And most of the concrete bricks are not load bearing. That's done on the side with reinforced steel and cement columns. So it's not load bearing. And I bet on that building, 80% of the concrete blocks could be hempcrete blocks.
Yeah, there's a tendency in commercial construction to go to tip up concrete precast panels now as
Mhm.
being less site labor than even laying concrete blocks. But
Mhm.
well, what they really need is to figure out how to use this hempcrete with those 3D printed houses that currently squirt concrete onto
Uh-huh.
the,
That's
and
right. Hey, what a good idea.
yeah,
And I think you may be onto something, and I bet it wouldn't surprise me to read in the months ahead that somebody copied your idea, Andrew.
yeah, I'll leave it. It's open source. Everyone's welcome to it.
Okay, that's good. That's good. And if you get the prize, go out and have a great dinner for the Dyson Prize. Okay, the next story is a space story, and the headline is Millions May Live in Space, but Near Earth. And space colonies give millions of people the opportunity to live in space close to the Earth and create futuristic utopian communities. Now, they did a survey connected with this, asking people, would you like to live in space? 3/4 said they don't want to, but more than 25% say they can actually imagine becoming a space citizen. And Gerard O'Neill presented in the 70s the idea for the future of humanity. He suggested that we should build space colonies instead of building cities on other planets. And these would be done in rotating cylinders that can create artificial gravity, and several million people could live on each of these space stations. And Jeff Bezos has given life to the idea. Bezos believes that colonies in space would allow humanity to continue to develop, and investment in space colonies is considerably smarter than investing in colonizing other planets. So by building large cylinder structures, artificial gravity can be created with a day and night cycle and a gravity similar to Earth. This gravity thing is actually a big deal. One of the biggest problems with colonizing other planets like Mars is there's a big difference between the gravitational force, and this reduced gravitational force affects our bodies, and not in a good way. Another problem they have to solve is radiation exposure, but this can be done with shielding materials like steel to reduce the radiation. And it's possible to build a space colony with today's technology. And to make it successful, we need to build a colony that's self-sufficient and financially sustainable. And, we had an article recently about how the cost of going into space is one of the things that is going to drop significantly in the coming years. And with the cost down, then the living in space becomes something that is more practical. And if you do it, you can create new worlds for humanity that have optimal conditions for where we live. When we're in the solar system, we basically have infinite raw materials on asteroids and from our own moon. Because of this, the lunar lander that Blue Origin Bezos company is making is a first step into their venture to build space colonies, and this would enable us to continue to develop without being limited by the Earth's resources. Now, if you're in space, there are a couple of other advantages. One is you don't have any natural disasters, I guess, except for the occasional asteroid wiping everybody out. And then you don't have a problem with hazardous emissions. And to do it effectively with our Earth-based population, we would do it further close to Earth, so it's easy to get around. And the quality of life could be good. In space colonies, we can avoid the mistakes we made on Earth and create amazing places to live. We have to have biodiversity and variety to feel good. So if we're going to settle in space, we have to prioritize biodiversity. And a space colony would give us the quality, an opportunity to create a world we want to live in. I have a few images. Let me show these to you. If I can. Okay, this is an idea of how it might look. This is similar. I think there was a science fiction series about the ring, which were ring shaped, the ring with the land area on the bottom and then open kind of model. You can see on the side some of the structural bracing that you would have. this is what it might look like. One idea of it rotating into space. Those are side. And, if you look, there is an increasing amount of money that is being spent around the world on space startups. So the adventures in space are starting to look promising to investors, and they're starting to figure out how they can take advantage of it, and they're making investments to do that. So uh, maybe space will open up in a different way than many of us think. And the idea of these orbiting space colony to me sounds pretty attractive. What do you guys think?
I think they'll be able to find people all right. I used to know a lot of people that were really spaced out anyway.
They were
Well,
already spaced out, huh?
Yeah.
I would go as long as you can afford to do it on Social Security.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing they haven't figured out is when Arizona had the biosphere 2, they couldn't make that work with only 8 people. And it cost 25 million bucks for each of the 8 people. And they tried it for 2 years and they couldn't keep it going.
So they got some work to do.
Well,
But
the
building-
idea of Jeff Bezos that he's going to have 200 million people in space by 2050 is just another pipe dream.
No, building a similar structure on Earth, like the biodome, sure makes a lot more sense, a lot lower cost.
Do that first, and once you can make that work, then think about getting it into space.
Well, I'm excited actually that Bezos is trying to do this because it seems to me like it's one of the ideas that can work in the long term. It's not going to be a short term solution, but time is pretty long, and we'll see. I certainly agree. It seems like a better idea than trying to put 1 billion people on Mars.
I think reducing population on Earth is probably a more efficient way to go.
Come on, Daryl. I at least expect a comment from you on this.
You're muted.
He's coming. He's doing it.
Well, I guess if you start populating space, at least in locally, when they say locally, I guess that means between the moon and the Earth, or
Yes.
between Mars and Earth.
I think it's between the moon and Earth.
It's definitely a lot more feasible than populating Mars right now, that's for sure, with the technology that we have. But overall, if we start putting communities out there, in 5 billion years, it doesn't matter. We're all going to be gone. The solar system's going to be gone. So I don't know, what's their time frame?
I think it's less than 5 billion years. And by then, they just have to put big engines on one end and shoot it out past the area that'll be destroyed.
Right? Hopefully they'll figure that out.
Anyway, so I like it that people are thinking big. Okay. To continue, the biology story is about an important green technology. This technology might be the most important environmental technology ever developed, which is a big statement. And it's protein fermentation, precision fermentation. And precision fermentation is a refined form of brewing, multiplying microbes to increase specific products. And it's been used for many years by drug companies to produce drugs and food additives. And scientists are now developing what could be a new generation of staple crops, of foods. And these developments, the interesting ones, use no agricultural feedstuffs. They grow microbes based on feeding them hydrogen or methanol, uh, which can be made with renewable electricity. And these are combined with water and carbon dioxide and a little fertilizer and a lot of sunlight. And they now can produce a flour that contains about 60% protein. And this is a much higher concentration than any major crop achieves now. Soybeans are only 37% protein, chickpeas are 20%. And when they're bred to produce specific proteins and fats, they can create much better replacements than the plant products for meat, fish, and eggs. And this, they have the potential to do two very significant things. The first is to shrink to a remarkable degree the footprint of food productions. There is one estimate that precision fermentation using methanol needs 1,700 times less land than the most efficient agricultural means of producing protein, which is growing soy. And this same calculation shows that it would be more than 100,000 times more efficient, use less land than beef and lamb production. This could enable a radical reduction in water use and greenhouse emissions and avoid many problems with animal and livestock production. And if livestock production was replaced by this technology, vast tracts now occupied by livestock could be used for rewilding the environment and helping the planet. The second possibility is this could break the dependency of many nations on food shipped from different places. Here you could have local food production facilities that are producing what the local people like. And this precision fermentation is at the top of its price curve now and has great potential for steep reduction. Farming is at the bottom of its price curve. It's pushed this production of livestock and farm stuff to their limits. And there are objections. One of them is the yuck factor. Yuck, bacteria. I don't want to eat bacteria, except we already eat them in cheese and yogurt and things like that. Second objection is that this high protein flour could be used to make ultra processed foods, which is not very healthy. But they can also be used to radically reduce the processing involved in making substitutes for animal products. So that's kind of a wash. The third objection is the concerns that people have had with genetically modified crops, such as Roundup Ready maize. But these are crops where the main purpose was to enlarge the market for a herbicide. But genetically modified microbes have already been used uncontroversially in precision fermentation for 50 years to do things like produce insulin and vitamins. And the fourth objection is the potential for these new technology to be captured by a few corporations. That's already the situation that we're in. There's dangerous concentration in the global grain trade, for example, where 90% of it is now in the hands of 4 corporations. The writer of this article says he thinks the biggest problem is what he calls neophobia, the fear of things that are new. We tend to defend the old and revile the new, even though it often should be the other way around. So this is another potential to have significant impact on the planet. This is a potential that is hard to realize, I think, because the habits of food and what we eat are so deeply ingrained in our culture that changing the way we're eating is a tough change. Just look at the trouble we're having around the world trying to adapt to more plant-based diets, for example. So changing how we eat is not easy, but it's one of the places where there's enormous opportunities. How about you? Are you ready to have your bacteria burger?
I may not be quite ready, but in the article, it described how this could be locally produced.
Yes.
So in some states, in many states in Africa, they can't get food, they can't grow it there. So, but they could do this.
Yes.
And so I think it's the kind of thing that has to be demonstrated where it will work. And, maybe it'll continue to grow from there. But the replacement of animals and the use of land that animals use, the methane, the cow farts that go up, that would be a good thing to reduce those.
And, I think I have thought for the last couple of years that both bacteria and algae are real promising for the creation of the next generation of food stuff. And one of the reasons is if you compare it to agriculture and animal husbandry, it's so much more efficient in terms of resources.
Well, and we all know how well beer and wine work. So maybe, and there's probably lots of people who could be persuaded to live on nothing but high protein beer. And look how much money we'd save on cutlery. So there you go. Good idea. Another good idea from the Guardian.
Yes. I'm sorry, those leftist pigs.
I brew beer, and I can tell you can make mistakes and have to dump it all. So, but I haven't tried this particular kind of a batch.
And again, I have the son of a friend of mine is a guy who got his degree in microbiology, and he has a company making high quality omega-3 oils. And he's growing them and making them in his bioreactor and growing bacteria to make this kind of vitamin product. So people are already doing it.
But Chad, I think Chad had a good point about places in Africa, because there's lots of places there where they eat kind of a porridge 3 times a day, if they're lucky.
Yes.
And so it wouldn't be difficult to enrich that porridge with a high protein additive.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So there are lots of ways that it could be
Yeah.
used.
And it wouldn't require a change in taste um, or texture or anything.
I think that's a real good point. Okay, so the next story is about China, and it turns out younger Chinese are spurning factory jobs that power the economy. An example here is a young man who grew up in a Chinese village, and he only saw his father a few times a year when he returned for holidays from his exhausting job in a textile mill. And for his father's generation, factory work was a lifetime out of rural poverty. But now, for younger Chinese, the low pay, long hours, and risks of injury are no longer sacrifices that are worth making. After a while, that kind of work makes your mind numb, says the young man. I couldn't stand the repetition. And this rejection of factory work is contributing to a deepening labor shortage in China that is frustrating a lot of manufacturers. Factory bosses say they could produce more and faster with younger workers replacing their aging workforce, but offering higher wages and better working conditions that the younger Chinese work would risk eroding their competitive advantage, which is low-cost manufacturing. Now more than 80% of Chinese manufacturers last year faced labor shortages, and it's equivalent to between 10 and 30% of their workforce, which is a significant number. On paper, labor is not in short supply. About 18% of the young Chinese aged 16 to 24 are unemployed, but they're not interested in working in the factories. Chinese fast economic growth in recent years has lifted the aspiration of the younger generations who now see working like their parents as increasingly unattractive. Uh, uh, there's a report of one company with a manufacturing company. He says it's been hard to get more young people. Applicants will have a quick look at their factory and say, no, thank you, that's not for me. And now in China, manufacturers say they have three main options to deal with the problems in the labor market. The first is to sacrifice profit margins to increase wages. And we know companies don't like to sacrifice profits. The second is to invest in more automation. And the third is to move their manufacturing to cheaper pastures such as Vietnam or India. And the Chinese policymakers have emphasized automation as a solution to an aging workforce. And in fact, half of the world's robots last year were installed in China. So they're doing this at a fairly high rate. And China's export-oriented manufacturing sector has been built over several decades based on state-subsidized investment in production capacity and low labor costs. And the preservation of that status quo is now clashing with the aspiration with a new generation of better educated Chinese who are looking for a more comfortable life. And many young Chinese are now increasingly adopting a minimal lifestyle known as laying flat, doing just enough to get by and rejecting the rat race. So this is a pretty significant changes in China and is one of the things that makes me feel like China's era of dominance in world trade is going to be coming to an end. So what do you guys think about the changes in China?
Well, there's a lot going on there right now with this resistance to the COVID lockdowns. So
Yes,
change is inevitable.
yes,
And the low birth rate supporting an increasingly gray population is a critical factor in China.
yes. And again, China is one of the places where I have read projections that something like by the end of the century, their population will go from 1.2 billion to 700 or 800 million. Profound changes. And, certainly I can see the interest in China in EVs because that's a lot more value added manufacturing. And maybe that's one of the ways to make your economy work with fewer people. Anyway, I think this coupled with the story about the changing birth rates in Japan and South Korea, all three of these stories talk about significant changes that are ahead in Asia, and the world is going to look a lot different in 40 or 50 years.
It affects business here too, I think. Because I'm just thinking that my son works. He's a radio developer, and he worked with a Chinese company, and they told him that no more, and so they bowed out of a big contract, about $30 million worth.
Okay, the last story for today is a medical story, and it's in an area where I think in our particular community of seniors is uh, of interest. And after years of setback, dementia researchers are getting excited about a new antibody drug called lecanemab, and it's not expected to stop cognitive decline, but even slowing it down would be a breakthrough. That's something that nothing has done so far. And this is based on a major clinical trial of this new drug, and the therapy showed uh, that it slowed cognitive decline. There are still questions about it, though, and even if you can slow the decline a small amount, this will really start to impact the economic and medical level and health of the senior population. The drug itself is not easy to administer. Patients are required to attend clinic twice a month for an intravenous infusion, so it's not particularly a user-friendly process, and you need to have medical help to use it. And it may not work well enough to be attractive to the people. Some doctors warn that the benefits might seem so small that patients might not even notice. And if it's hard to administer, that's going to make it even less attractive. But still, if you can slow the decline even small amount, you can really start to see an impact on the economic and medical situations with the drug. Uh, the FDA in America will rule on the use of this drug in January of 2023. The trial suggests that the drug slowed cognitive decline. After 18 months, cognition declined 27% less in those who took the drug compared to those with a placebo. And while the result is statistically significant, it may not mean much for individual patients. And some are already saying we may really need to wait for something better. But others say what really needs to be trumpeted from this trial is that you can change the rate of decline for the disease. And they hope that this will attract more research. It's likely that more research has been done on COVID in the last 3 years than on dementia in the last century. And the real hope may lie in different approaches, but these different approaches still have to be funded. What the fight needs now is more funding, more approaches, more trials. But they are saying we are beginning to see a future where we can make dementia a chronic condition, one you live with and die with, but don't die from. So this is hopeful, but not as hopeful as we would like.
Yeah, just a comment. I was really excited when I started reading it, and by the time I finished reading it, I was not too excited. With all the side effects of the drug, the difficulty in delivering the drug, and then the very slow incremental difference it makes, it almost sounds like it's not worth it. But an incremental change is a significant thing to have happen, and I can see that this is going to inch forward. You know, this is going to move it forward, which is a good thing.
Yes, like you, I was less excited when I finished reading it than I was when I began. But again, if you think of it, dementia is something that progresses over several years. And if it slows it down by 27%, then if it takes 4 years for it to proceed to where it becomes debilitating, the person will end up gaining a year of actual useful life.
And as they better understand this stuff, they'll get so they can add it to the water supply, like fluoride or chlorine, and we can prevent it over life. But you know, why is there this huge interest in extending life rather than improving a shorter life?
Well, this is a big deal in quality of life. It's not a matter of extending life so much as extending healthy life.
But it's for old people. They need to put more emphasis on education and improving the lives of young people and middle-aged people. And they should have us old people looking forward to the end of this life and looking forward to whatever's in the next one. So,
Okay, let's all run out and
any,
die.
yeah.
If any.
No, Andrew's point is very well taken. Focusing on people in their productive years, that they remain more productive, is more important than extending life.
And that they're happier and they enjoy that life better. There's lots of people that aren't in very nice lives. And you know that earlier point about the Japanese and the Korean working people, they did a survey here, and something over 60% of the women, working women that they interviewed or surveyed, said they'd rather not be working. So they'd rather be at home. Now, they didn't say anything about at home taking care of children, but they aren't in particularly rewarding jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that everyone has a career with a satisfying work experience is a illusion. In many ways, we've removed the satisfaction from jobs when we moved them from craft jobs to assembly line jobs.
Well,
I didn't mean to call a halt to the conversation.
okay, well, you shut us down today, Andrew, but I was always happy in the jobs that I had, but none of the jobs were assembly line jobs.
And we're all the fortunate few. We're not the multitude.
Uh-huh. Well, be grateful for your good fortune and enjoy it while you can. And thank you all for joining me this week, and we'll see you next week.
Before you go, Richard, how's Harlan doing? Mardell, is he still part of the show?
He's doing fine. He just is now on this day doing something at LCS with TED Talks.
Oh, okay.
And before he started doing Hot Science, he had been doing TED Talks there for some time, and now they were able to start them up again.
Okay, we just hadn't seen him for a while, and I wondered what was going on.
That's right. I miss him too. But anyway, he's okay. And adios, and we'll see you next week, friends.
Adios.